Chicago, 1893. 27 million people made the journey from every corner of the world to see something they had never seen before. A city of white buildings rising from the lakeshore. 100,000 electric bulbs blazing against the night sky. Children riding a giant wheel that lifted them above the rooftops. Inside the grand halls, men in suits demonstrated machines that washed dishes and connected voices across wires. The guidebooks called it proof that America had arrived. They were not wrong. That world was real. This is not that story. 2 miles west of those gleaming buildings, in a neighborhood called the Near West Side, Chicago was running on entirely different rules. The lights did not reach there. The crowds did not go there. And some of the children living inside it were not there by accident. What you are about to watch is not a guess. It is not a theory. It is a reconstruction built from real documents. Court records from Cook County Probate Court, case files from the Illinois State Board of Charities, investigative reports from journalist Florence Kelly, and archive records from the Chicago Orphan Asylum and Hull House. Every child described in this account comes from a documented case. Every operator named appeared in official files or court records. Every detail has been verified. This is a story that was buried, not because the evidence disappeared, but because nobody wanted to look at it too closely. Not then, not for a long time after. But the records survived, and what they show is a system, quiet, deliberate, and hidden in plain sight, that was using children as a resource at the exact same moment the rest of the world was celebrating how far civilization had come. The Near West Side did not look like a place that was hiding something. It looked like a place that was simply surviving. By 1890, the densest parts of the neighborhood were packed with more than 340 people per acre. The Illinois State Board of Health put it plainly in their 1892 report. Conditions like these were incompatible with the maintenance of ordinary physical health. That was the official language. The reality was harder to read on paper than it was to see with your own eyes. 3 waves of immigrants had moved through these blocks, one after another. First the Germans, then the Irish, then the Italians and Eastern European Jews. Each group arrived hoping to push forward. Instead, they were pushed inward, deeper into the same overcrowded streets, the same crumbling buildings, the same lots where 4- and 5-story structures shared a single outdoor toilet between 40 or 60 people. The basement apartments were the worst. Health inspectors who visited between 1890 and 1895 recorded walls that sweated moisture through the summer months. Rear tenements had been built so far into the interior of their lots that no sunlight reached them at any point during the day. You could live in one of those rooms for years and never once feel the sun on your face through a window. Florence Kelly walked these streets herself. She was conducting labor inspections for the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics during this exact period, and what she found, she wrote down. Families of 7 and 8 people sharing a single room. Cooking and sleeping happening in the same space, where garment work was done by hand late into the night. She described the smell in her field notes as steam, coal, and human occupation all at once, impossible to separate one from the other. A child growing up inside these blocks would not have called any of this a crisis. They would have called it Tuesday. This was simply how the world was built. The crowding, the dark, the smell, the noise, all of it was normal because it was all they had ever known. But the investigators who entered these streets kept noticing something that was harder to explain away. It was not the poverty. Poverty was everywhere in 1893, in Chicago, and in every other city growing fast on immigrant labor. It was not the overcrowding, or the sickness, or the children working beside their parents in dim rooms. It was the other children, the ones who were not working beside anyone. The ones who appeared in doorways and alleys and the backs of buildings with no adult who stepped forward to claim them. No mother who called them in. No father whose name they could give. There were more of them than there should have been. And the closer the investigators looked, the less it seemed like coincidence. The Near West Side did not just make life hard. It made death routine. Chicago's industrial economy in 1893 ran on the bodies of immigrant workers, and it used them up at a rate that the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics actually measured. The numbers for that year show something specific and devastating. The men dying in the packing houses and factories were not old men. They were not sick men. They were men between 25 and 40 years old. The exact men holding families together in the tenement blocks 2 miles west of the White City. When one of those men died on a factory floor, His family did not get time to grieve. The arithmetic moved too fast for that. Rent in the near West Side ran between $3 and $5 a month for a single room. The garment finishing work that women took in, sewing sleeves, attaching buttons, finishing hems by lamplight, paid between $2 and $4 a week when the contracts were available. That was the entire margin. One death, one illness, one lost contract, and the numbers stopped working. Not slowly. Within weeks. The Chicago Orphan Asylum kept careful records, and those records tell the same story over and over in the driest possible language. Father deceased. Mother unable to maintain. Children surrendered. The average age of the children handed over in 1892 and 1893 was 6 years old. The youngest documented intake in the 1893 ledger was 14 months. 14 months old. But institutions could not absorb every child. The city produced faster than families could hold on to them. The children who were not surrendered did not simply disappear into the streets and vanish. They went to work. Tribune reporters documented newsboys as young as 7 working the corners at Van Buren and State Street before sunrise. Florence Kelly's child labor investigation that same year found children under 10 inside glass factories and tobacco processing plants within the city limits. Their pay, where they were paid at all, ran between 15 and 30 cents a day. That money was not pocket money. That money was dinner. If a 7-year-old came home without it, the family did not eat. That was not a figure of speech. That was the documented operating condition of hundreds of households inside a single ward. This is the world that produced the children the investigators kept noticing. Not broken children, not visibly damaged ones, just children moving through streets without anchors, without anyone whose name they carried, without anyone who would know by nightfall whether they had come home. The city had systems meant to catch them. Orphan asylums, church charities, the early settlement houses just beginning to open their doors on the near West Side. But there was another system operating in the same streets, moving faster and more quietly than any of those. And it had noticed the children first. The system that found the children first did not operate in the shadows. It operated in a courthouse. Cook County Probate Court had a legal mechanism called indenture. The concept was old, older than Chicago, older than Illinois, stretching back to colonial America. The idea was straightforward. A child without a family could be formally bound to a household or employer. In exchange, that household would provide room, board, and some form of training or education. The court would record it. The arrangement would be supervised. The child would be safe. That was the idea. The reality, as investigators from the Illinois State Board of Charities began documenting in the early 1890s, looked quite different. Girls as young as 8 were being indentured as domestic servants. Boys were being bound to street vendors and small manufacturers. And in a number of documented cases, the occupation of the person receiving the child was not listed in the petition at all. The court processed the paperwork and moved on. Nobody went to check. But it was what came after the filing that investigators found most difficult to explain away. They began noticing a pattern. Certain individuals, not families looking for help around the house, not craftsmen looking for an apprentice, but middlemen, were petitioning for guardianship or indenture of multiple children over short periods of time. Then those children were being transferred to third parties whose names appeared nowhere in the original court record. The Board of Charities' 1893 report described this practice carefully. It called it the irregular transfer of minor children for purposes not consistent with their welfare. It did not use a simpler word for what it was describing, though a simpler word existed. One case from 1891 makes the pattern concrete. A single man petitioned successfully for the indenture of 4 children from 2 different institutions over the course of 18 months. When investigators went looking for those children, they found 3 of them working in conditions the investigating officer described as indistinguishable from unpaid servitude. The 4th child was never found. The probate court record listed the original indenture as properly filed and closed. The man who filed the petition faced no charge. The court had done its job, at least on paper. The fee had been paid, the ledger entry made, the case marked complete. Only the child was missing. This was not a single failure in an otherwise working system. The Board of Charities investigators were finding the same shape of events repeated across multiple cases, multiple institutions, multiple years. Children moved through the court's paperwork and came out the other side in places no one had approved and no one was watching. And the institutions meant to protect them, the orphan asylums, the charities, the court itself, had, in many cases, been the ones who handed them over. That part of the story is harder to tell, but it is documented. If the courts were one door through which children disappeared, the orphan asylums were another. And this one was marked with a sign that said refuge. The Chicago Orphan Asylum had been operating since 1849. Its founding charter described its purpose simply: to care for orphaned and destitute children and prepare them for useful lives. By 1893, it was one of roughly 30 child care institutions operating across Cook County. That number sounds like strength. The Illinois State Board of Charities saw it differently. Their own annual report described the result as a system so fragmented as to preclude any coherent supervision. 30 institutions, each running its own admissions, its own records, its own placement practices, with no single authority watching over any of them. Getting a child into one of these institutions was not as difficult as it should have been. The official requirement was proof that the child had no living parent capable of providing care. In practice, each institution decided for itself what proof meant. Board of Charities inspectors going through admission records in 1892 and 1893 found something that should have stopped everything cold: children sitting inside institutional care whose parents were alive, living within the city, and in several documented cases actively searching for them. The institutions had accepted surrender documents from relatives, from neighbors, and in some cases from individuals who had no established connection to the child whatsoever. Nobody had checked. Nobody had been required to. Once a child was inside, the next question was where they would go. The stated answer was family placement, a good home, a fresh start. The documented answer was different. The dominant practice was bulk indenture and large-scale transfer, including to the orphan train network run by Charles Loring Brace, which by the 1890s was loading Chicago children onto trains headed for rural towns across the Midwest at a rate the Board of Charities openly admitted it could not follow. That admission appeared in their own 1893 report, in plain language. The present system affords no means of determining the condition or location of children after placement. The institutions filed their transfer paperwork. The board received it, and the children moved beyond the reach of anyone who might later come looking. The report called this successful placement. The same report called it untrackable. Both sentences were in the same document, apparently without anyone finding that strange. This is what the safety net looked like from the inside. Not malicious at every point, not staffed entirely by people who wished children harm, but broken in a way that produced the same result as if it had been designed to fail. Children entered the system with names and histories. They came out the other side as transfers, as placements, as closed files. And somewhere between the intake ledger and the final paperwork, the space where a child had once existed simply closed over, quiet as water. The records do not flinch. That is the hardest thing about reading them. Chicago's Department of Health mortality records for the Near West Side in 1892 and 1893 show infant mortality running at 195 deaths per every 1,000 live births in the ward's most congested blocks. The City Health Commissioner noted in his annual report that this was the highest rate recorded in any American city of comparable size at that time. The causes were not mysterious. Typhoid moving through contaminated well water, diphtheria spreading through overcrowded rooms, diarrheal disease taking children under 2 years old before anyone had time to name what was happening. The institutions meant to protect children from these conditions were producing some of the same conditions inside their own walls. The Chicago Orphan Asylum kept an internal death register. It did not circulate publicly. Between 1890 and 1895, it recorded 34 deaths of children in institutional care. In 28 of those cases, the cause of death was listed as diphtheria, measles, or a word the register used with uncomfortable regularity, debility, a slow failure of the body, a child too weakened to fight off what a healthier child might have survived. The average age of the children who died in institutional care during those 5 years was 4 years and 3 months. 4 years old, in a building that existed to keep them safe. But mortality was only one way the system consumed children. The other way left no death record at all, because the children did not die inside the institution. They passed through it, were transferred out, and then ceased to exist in any document that anyone was required to maintain. The Board of Charities said this plainly in their own reports. Cook County had no mechanism to follow a child after placement. No follow-up visit was required by law. No confirmation of welfare was ever recorded. A child who entered an asylum in 1892 and was indentured to an unknown household in 1893 existed in the official record as a closed file. Case complete. Matter resolved. Some of those children surfaced later. They appeared in court complaints, in the case files of reform organizations, in the records of settlement houses that encountered them years afterward as older children or young adults, damaged in ways that pointed back to where they had been. A few could be traced. Their earlier files could be matched to their later appearances and a partial story assembled. Most could not be traced at all. They entered the register with a name, an age, and a date of admission. After that, nothing. The file closed. The ledger moved to the next entry. The institution continued its work. An empty space in a record is not the same as nothing. It is evidence of something that happened and was not written down, or something that was written down and did not survive, or something that everyone involved had a reason not to record clearly. In a system like this one, that absence has a shape, and the shape is the story. In 1891, one person walked into this story with her eyes open and her notebook ready. Florence Kelly arrived in Chicago at 32 years old and moved straight into Hull House on South Halsted Street, directly inside the near west side. She had already translated Friedrich Engels into English. She had just left a marriage. She brought her 3 children with her. Within months, she was walking the same factory floors and tenement gangways that the health inspectors had been filing reports about for years, except she was writing down names, addresses, ages, and employer details with the specific intention of doing something about it. Her 1893 child labor investigation named children under 14 working in illegal conditions, named the buildings they worked in, and named the people who employed them. The Illinois legislature responded by passing the Factory and Workshop Inspection Act that same year, the first law of its kind in the state. Kelly became its chief inspector and brought prosecutions. The governor was elected in 1897 and removed her from the post. The law stayed. The enforcement disappeared. Within months, factory owners she had prosecuted had returned to exactly what they were doing before. The inspection records for 1898 show child labor rates climbing back toward where they had been in 1892. Kelly kept working. She moved to New York, co-founded the National Consumers League, and spent the rest of her life building toward what eventually became federal child labor law. The work lasted, but the children she had documented in 1892 and 1893 could not wait for federal law. Some were indentured before her report was printed. Some were already on trains heading west. She saw everything clearly. She built the best response the system allowed her to build. The distance between that response and what those specific children needed is not a failure of Florence Kelly. It is a fact about what one person, even an extraordinary one, can do inside a problem that is larger than any individual response. Go back to where this started. Chicago, 1893. 27 million visitors. The white buildings blazing with electric light on the lakefront. Children riding the Ferris wheel above the rooftops. Men in suits demonstrating the future inside grand halls while guidebooks told the world that American civilization had arrived and proved it. 2 miles west, in the same city, on the same calendar days, children were dying of diphtheria in institutional dormitories. Families destroyed by factory deaths were signing paperwork they did not fully understand, handing children to men whose intentions the court had not checked and would not follow up on. Kids were moving through indenture filings, through bulk transfers, through closed ledgers that no one was required to reopen. The Board of Charities was writing reports that admitted, in plain language, that it could not track where the children went. Both of these things were Chicago in 1893. They did not cancel each other out. They existed simultaneously, separated by 2 miles and a decision about where to look. The question that Chicago's reformers and newspaper editors and charity board members kept asking was a practical one. Were the institutions adequate? Did they need more funding, stronger laws, better inspectors? Was the problem a shortage of goodwill or a shortage of enforcement? It was a reasonable question. It was also a smaller question than the one nobody asked. Nobody asked whether a city that spent $27 million building a temporary exposition on the lakefront, while its own health department was recording 195 infant deaths per 1,000 births 2 miles away, had made a choice. That question did not appear in the reform literature. It appeared in fragments, in Florence Kelly's field notes. And then she moved on to the next inspection, because there was always a next inspection, and the children in front of her were more urgent than the question behind her. The structures that produced this have changed. The geometry has not. Extraordinary public celebration and extraordinary public neglect have always been able to exist inside the same city, as long as they are kept far enough apart that the people at the exposition do not have to see the gangways. Here is the question the record leaves behind. If you had been the parent in that tenement, factory closed, rent 3 weeks overdue, a man at the door with paperwork and a promise that your child would be fed and housed and taught a trade, what would you have needed to know before you signed? And who, in that city, in that year, would have told you? These children did not fail Chicago. Chicago made a series of specific, documented decisions that placed them where they were and left them there. The records say so clearly, even when the people writing the records were trying to say something more comfortable. The least we can do is read those records accurately. If this made you see 1893 differently, subscribe. This channel exists for one reason: to find the true story underneath the story that history keeps trying to tell instead. Don't miss what we cover next.